Professor Kerry Brown, Professor Ehtashami and I couldn't be more excited than having you with us, and it's a joy to welcome you to BRI Dialogues.
Thank you very much. It's great to be here.
For our growing audience, I want to take just a few seconds and go quickly over your impressive background. You're a professor of Chinese Studies and director of Lau Chau Institute at King's College London, an associate of the Asia Pacific program at Chatham House London, an adjunct of Australia-New Zealand School of Government in Melbourne, co-editor of the Journal of Current Chinese Affairs run from the German Institute of Global Affairs in Hamburg, president-elect of Kent Archaeological Society, an affiliate of the Mongolia and Inner Asia Studies University, Cambridge, and last but not least, the author of China Incorporated, The Politics of a World Where China is #1, which I highly recommend to our audience. Now, I want to kick off with this question. Given your assessment on the rise of China and the optics from West, is there, in your view, a trajectory from neoliberalism to Western universalism, Western exceptionalism? And are we arriving to perhaps an era that US and the West are in particular failing to appreciate China and her ascendance and arrival as a power? And is that something more to do with the United States dealing with what I would say the picture of Dorian Gray, that US is in denial of the image of where US is versus China in that context?
Yeah, thank you. Well, the book that you referred to, China Incorporated, was inspired really by thinking about, how in 2008, when the great economic crisis happened, there was a lot of Chinese companies appeared for the first time, as potential investors. And I remember thinking at the time, a lot of people were saying we shouldn't really be worried because, Chinese companies coming to list in London or New York, they would have to abide by the rules of those markets. And we were rules-based. We would be able to deal with outsiders. We wouldn't have a problem. And I suppose what I find strange is that that confidence is now very much gone. It seems that we think that China brings with it a sort of special kind of risk, and that we can't deal with it. We feel that China is influencing and, meddling in politics and doing things that we don't really understand. And I sort of wondered why we had become so unconfident, why that happened. Now you refer to America. I mean, I think it's true that the United States on the outside does look highly conflicted now, and it looks like it's getting worse. There's every possibility that Donald Trump will be re-elected, and that's a very strange outcome. I think for anyone, they would be very, very bewildered by how that was possible. And in that case, it's hard to sort of look at the Western models and say that these are unproblematic. And I'm not saying that they're terrible. I'm not saying that they're complete failures. I mean, that's not my argument. My argument really is that I don't think that there are any sort of easy models in this story to say, right, this is where people should all be trying to go towards. And I think that China, has its own very significant problems. But I can understand completely now why a Chinese politician looking at what is happening in America and elsewhere in Europe wouldn't find attractive models to follow for their politics with what we're doing.
Kerry, that's wonderful. By the way, it's a real pleasure to have you on BRI Dialogues. I've enjoyed reading you and listening to you immensely. Your book is very challenging, obviously, but also very informative. I wonder how Chinese audiences received China being seen as #1, because when we've spoken to Chinese officials or indeed senior academics, they always want to dispel that as a myth, that China is not wanted to be #1. It's not looking for hegemony and so on. So how did you process that kind of responses you might have had, and what do you imply by China being number one?
Yeah, well, I mean, so one very simple way is, well, what would the world look like if China were to be the biggest economy? Not in per capita terms, but just in gross terms. And I know a lot of people think that'll never happen. I saw a sort of data set yesterday saying that America continues to grow very strongly and is now sort of slightly bigger than it was over China even a year ago. So it may well be total, speculation. However, to me, it's not whether China will become number one. It's why are we panicking so much? The idea, it's about this issue of confidence that I referred to earlier. That 15 years ago, I think America and Europe had some kind of confidence, and I don't think that's there anymore. And I'm just really puzzled why. Now, I think Chinese officials and leaders, they are aware of the trap, to sort of suddenly start to act like they were number one would, of course, immediately bring a lot of kind of rancor and a lot of problems from America, particularly. I think that America is very uncomfortable with the idea of a competitor, particularly a competitor like China. And so China's had to play this very subtle game of, always pretending that it's not trying to usurp America, trying to make clear that it's just after its own space. But it's pretty inevitable that, the world's second biggest economy at the moment and the world's second largest population, it's going to need a space that's, suitable for it. It can't just carry on being this humble little mouse. And I suppose that the problem we have at the moment is, kind of China, which has this status, but it doesn't really seem to be able to kind of sort of speak and act with that status because it's accused of being more ambitious and more sort of domineering than it might actually be. I mean, the fundamental question is, does China really want to replace the United States?
Right.
I don't think it does.
Right.
I think it just wants a specific space for itself, and that's challenging.
Right.
But I don't think it's looking for a new world order where it dominates.
I've got a two-pronged question before Ali jumps in. Some say that there is this kind of xenophobic and racist dimension to it. That some say, when the wind went out of Japan's sails, the Americans accepted Japan as a second fiddle power. But in the 80s, Japan was seen as this great yellow peril, challenging America, destroying American industry. The narrative that was out there. And that somehow, because China is a different kind of power with solid civilization, that it actually poses a cultural challenge to Western dominance. And that is why there is this tension. But on the other hand, Kerry, we see that actually the West is very comfortable with the rise of India, which is also a non-Western kind of power. All right, they sit very differently in the pecking order. But where do you sit in terms of there is a racist component to this or not? And if the West and the Americans positively court India, why are they fearful of China?
Well, I mean, I think that's a great question. I mean, I don't think the principal challenge that China offers the West, and by the West I mean America, Europe, and Australia, New Zealand, the sort of liberal democracies. I mean, I don't think that it's principally economic, it's not necessarily military. The greatest challenge is cultural. I mean, China is a cultural challenge, and that's very deep. You're looking at a place with a sense of cultural identity which is very, very strong, and has a deep tradition going back well, thousands of years, maybe not 5,000, but certainly, several thousand years. And this is one of the world's great civilized traditions. So you can't just sort of ignore it by saying, well, we've superseded all of that. So I think that these issues of the cultural difference of China have been ones the West has struggled with for hundreds of years, since the time of the Enlightenment. Kind of figures like Leibniz, Voltaire, Montesquieu, they all have these perspectives of China as very, very different. And some were admiring, some were, kind of very, very critical. So we've had this problem around for a long, long time. It's not a new problem. India is different because it's a democracy, but we know that actually India's nationalism is every bit as problematic as China's. And under Modi, it's going to become more and more difficult. It's just that I think that there's a sense as a democracy that we can relate to it more easily. Whether part of the problem now is that the narratives the West have can't really accommodate a world in which a non-European or a non, kind of Western North American country is going to be very dominant. I mean, I think that does have a space. There is a problem about that. I think many people are very uncomfortable with the idea that suddenly there are these players like China, like India, and they're not part of the Western tradition, and yet they are so hugely important in the global economy and the global geopolitical system. And I mean, to me, it's just strange because if you look at the general development of the world in the last 30 years, there's been overwhelming improvements because of lifting Chinese and Indian people out of poverty. I mean, people are very pessimistic in America and Europe. They think things are getting worse and worse. But across the board, actually, things have been getting significantly better because vast numbers of people in those two places and more, but particularly in those two places, are living prosperous, better lives than ever before, which I would have thought would have been something to celebrate. However, it's regarded as being a big, big problem. So I think we have to remember that, this is a very complex transition that we're going through. But at heart is the kind of admission to the global order of, groups of people who really haven't ever figured before. And that to me is an incredible transformation.
Kerry, it's very interesting listening to you. You've done a great deal of work in studying Wang Hunning and, the role of culture. Preparing for our call and this episode, I was thinking and reflecting of your articulation of the role of culture, and I realized that Thanksgiving was enshrined in the calendar by Abraham Lincoln as a celebration for harvest, and it was taken to Japan after the Second World War, and to Grenada, it coincides as Thanksgiving with the anniversary of US-led invasion of Grenada. And then I was thinking that Mooncake Festival goes 3,000 years and hardly there is anywhere celebrated Mooncake Festival by Chinese occupation. In that context and the role of culture, do you think, given particularly the past 3 months and the tragedy in Middle East unfolding and the rest, because of that weight of culture, there is more perhaps reception to the global security initiative that China is rolling out? And will the world order be more receptive to that versus America's, I would say, exceptionalism, you think?
Yeah, I mean, I think both on the Russian invasion of Ukraine and on the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, China has issued two sets of proposals, I suppose you'd call them, or initiatives. They are not particularly detailed. I mean, they're very aspirational. I suppose, what it shows is that in the new kind of world order emerging, we've got a kind of acceptance that the way that things used to be done, particularly by America and its allies, they've kind of not really succeeded, right? I mean, the withdrawal from Afghanistan was an incredible moment, total sort of calamity in some ways. And I think that when we look at what's happened in the last 24 months, yeah, for sure, China doesn't have a very solid proposal. But then I guess its point is that the West doesn't seem to have any answers to either. I mean, and the kind of approach that China is taking, I mean, I think many people thought that it would be much more strident in getting involved on Russia's side, or, that it would want to be much more opportunistic and kind of get involved in these issues, which it would if it were the sort of power that some people make it out to be, one that wants to kind of dominate. But actually what we see is a China which is very resistant to that. And I suspect in the future, what's going to be the problem is not a China which is over assertive and domineering and coming and bossing people around. It's going to be the opposite, a China that doesn't really want to get involved unless it's absolutely necessary. And that's a different kind of problem. You've got a sort of world where the main power, one of the most important powers, is quite passive, and not particularly keen to kind of assert and commit itself. So I think, that's kind of not the vision that people usually attribute to China. They give it this muscular, sort of very forceful, international role. But I see a China which is extremely reluctant to get involved in things that it doesn't feel that it has a direct interest in. And that's a different kind of problem.
That's exactly where I was going to take you, Kerry, actually, because there is now much. Well, actually, there's as you know, is a two-edged sword. For those who see President Xi Jinping having this master plan for global domination, that he's changing the party, he's changing structures of power. Xi Jinping thought is now becoming dominant narrative in Chinese discourse, and that slowly but surely, with all these initiatives, civilization initiative, development initiative, security initiative, such like, that China is looking to create a parallel structure that by 2049, it will then be able to expose as its alternative. So there is all of that going on. And then there is the other side that you've rightly pointed out, that actually there is a danger of a real vacuum in which the West no longer has the confidence or the wherewithal to deal with this multitude of security, state and human security, climate change and such like, on the one hand. And on the other hand, a China that says, you know what, South China Sea, I'll take it. Taiwan, I'll take it. Central Asia, I'll carry on with that. But the rest of it is not my problem, pal. What do we do in that vacuum? And also, do you buy these notions, recent narratives about China having this master plan that is slowly but surely beginning to take shape?
Well, I mean, I don't think, I think you're right. I don't think there's a master plan in Beijing, and Xi Jinping, I don't think, has this sort of blueprint for global domination. I mean, I think in the last 10 years, probably what no one expected was the way in which the confidence of the West and its capacity has declined quite quickly. And I think that that's as much a problem for China as it is an opportunity. I mean, one of the problems is that I don't think China expected this sort of big space to open up so quickly. I think it always assumed that for the foreseeable decades, America would be very dominant, and China would be working within that framework, building up its own interests and actually getting some benefit from the security kind of guarantees that America gave in the Pacific, at least. These things are boundaries that China can work within. What it's dealing with now, however, is a sort of highly distracted, and if Trump gets re-elected later this year, very likely to be extremely unpredictable superpower, which China will have to sort of create its own predictability in a way. I mean, you know, its biggest assumption is going to be knocked out of the water. So I think this is the sort of reality that it's dealing with. It's extremely challenging. I don't think that China can just pick the things that it wants to kind of have, you know, benefit from and neglect other things. I mean, you mentioned the South China Sea or Taiwan or East China Sea, and, you know, okay, China can take those and forget everything else. The problem is that everything is connected now, and it would need to have a narrative for its work in Africa, a narrative for its work in Latin America, I mean, a narrative for its work in Europe. It can't really sort of have a localized strategy and leave the rest alone. And I think that's where Chinese diplomacy really groans under the pressure, because it doesn't really have an easy way to speak to the world. The problem is that we're living in an age in which a fundamentally important player does not have an easy language to use to the rest of the world. It's not that China is so persuasive and forceful and attractive that everyone is swooning under the kind of, you know, new influence. The problem is that everyone is extremely antagonistic towards China, when sometimes that's probably not merited. That's the problem. It's a very different kind of issue from China having a compelling narrative. The problem is it doesn't have a compelling narrative, and it should do.
Kerry, that's really interesting. Latest Pew Research among Americans have found 55% angry about the state of US politics of American citizens, 63% no faith in the future of US political system. And with the arrival of second Trump presidency, you earlier said, you know, who would have thought, and my brain was telling me if they elected George W. Bush twice, why not Donald Trump twice? So I'm not that surprised in the re-election of Trump, but I think Europe will have a rude awakening, because if Trump comes into power with, you know, tariffs and that's, I would say, inward looking, and leaves Europe with Nord Stream now cut, where do you think Brussels will find itself in posturing towards Beijing and that connectivity of the heartland, and in a, you know, second Trump administration? And how would that China will be able to embrace Europe again, so that again in another 4 years somebody else comes and shoos Europe again away from China? How do you think will that affect this dance of courtiers of Europe between China and United States?
Yeah, well, it is a dance. You're right. It's a dance and a game. I mean, Brussels will be very squeezed because, you know, Trump will expect some kind of loyalty, and he will expect America's commercial interests or economic interests to be respected. And so, you know, Brussels won't be able to kind of gaily go off to Beijing and do all sorts of new deals because of the very poor kind of quality of the relationship, you know, between China and America. I mean, that kind of almost happened, I think, in 2017, 2018. You know, Brussels and China kind of started to get much closer, and then, you know, America gave great pressure, and it wasn't really possible. So I think it's going to be a very, very tricky time. In fact, you know, that's already the case. Even under the Biden administration, America expects loyalty from its allies, and Europe and Britain, we're all kind of really squeezed by this, because we you know, don't completely align with America's view on China sometimes. I mean, many issues we do, but a lot we don't. And yet, you know, kind of we have to be aware that America is still the biggest security partner. So this is a game of loyalty. I don't think that's going to change anytime soon. Fundamentally, because China's security outlook and its security narrative is not one that Europe can really embrace. So it's going to be a very, very tough time in the years ahead for Brussels to have a kind of well-defined China policy that manages to balance its obligations to America and its interests in China.
Mm. Kerry, you've rightly focused on history of China's interactions with the world, but also its own rise as a major nation state. When we look around, as you said earlier, China's footprint is now not just growing, but it's assertive in so many parts of the world, economically speaking, that is. And in a sense, we have Secretary of State following in the footsteps of Chinese representatives in Africa, for example, trying to sell brand America. But wherever Western diplomatic or commercial interests go, they will find that there's an open door for China already. So when taking on forward Ali's comment about the dangers of a return by Trump, so where would European powers try to locate themselves? First, Europe itself becomes a questionable geopolitical landscape, environment, space. But in the rest of the world, if the Americans either withdraw or demand kind of rent for being the champion, what can Europeans seriously do to continue to advance their interests and keep the rest of us in Europe prosperous, frankly?
Well, it's it's a long-term problem. I mean, obviously, America is still a hugely important economic and security partner, and China, until now, for Europeans, has been principally a kind of supplier, but also for Germany, for instance, it's been an enormously important market for its technology. Germany's got a unique relationship with China, even though it's transformed a bit lately. So I think I don't foresee in the near future Europe wanting to jeopardize its relationships with America too much. I think it will go with America when it has to. I mean, it will continue to do that. Long term, it's very hard to say. I mean, if China gets through this current very tough economic situation and manages to create a kind of successful middle income, status economy, and if it does start to create important new technology, and if it does, kind of go up the sort of value chain, and everything kind of goes the way that it wants. I know that's not hugely likely, but if that does happen, well, then there's going to be some point a strategic choice that's necessary, because that's going to mean that Europe is balanced between a place which is offering huge new sort of potential and huge new opportunities, and one where we kind of know what we're getting because we've got it and we'll continue to get it, but it will just remain very static. That will be a difficult moment. I mean, Europe has never really had the guts to kind of make a big choice, and hasn't had to until now. But at some point in the next decade, it might have to. And I think it's going to be a big, big wrench, because I think a lot of the assumptions that security and prosperity in Europe are built on will have to be rethought and rewritten. I mean, just finally, it's not just the stuff about economic cooperation, but I mean, also the enormous impact of global warming and climate change. This is becoming very visible already. I mean, it's getting critical. And the impact of that on global politics, on domestic politics in countries is, I think, going to get more and more significant. And I wonder, in view of China and its absolute central importance on that issue, because it is the world's greatest carbon emissions producer now, and if it can't control that, then we have all got a massive problem. If China does produce something that can kind of address global warming, then the kind of geopolitics around that is really, really interesting, because it kind of prioritizes something which is an existential issue, really. And it's not really about, okay, China influencing and getting involved in things we don't like. It's about China contributing to something that enormously helps everyone else. And I think that will be a key element of what's going to happen in the next decade have a very profound impact on the relationship.
And of course, we'll have the problem of if a climate change denier is re-elected in the United States, what we in Europe are going to do to encourage China in particular to stay the course. I know China is committed to this for all sorts of reasons, but what happens if a climate denier then comes out and starts tearing up things, doesn't turn up to COP meetings and such like?
Yeah, I mean, the great thing about China in the last 10 years, which is one of the positives, is that, you know, Xi Jinping is an environmentalist. I mean, people are very critical of China's environmental record. And yeah, its rapid industrialization has had a devastating impact on all aspects of the Chinese environment. But I mean, Xi Jinping, from before he became national leader, was a believer in environmentalism. I mean, that's a good thing. I mean, if we had a climate change denier in China, we would really have an absolutely disastrous situation. I mean, as I understand it, in America, the states themselves are able to do a lot on climate, like California, despite what their president says. So I think that no matter what, the commitment in America to doing something about the environment will continue. The Biden administration has been strong on this. A new Trump presidency will obviously have a big impact, but I don't think it'll really change the direction of travel. It will just, you know, kind of impact on the speed of that travel, and that might be very, very critical. I mean, the important thing is that China's current targets for carbon emissions and carbon neutrality are not ambitious enough. I mean, it's clearly got to go much, much faster. And if it can do that, we have a better chance of dealing with this calamity than you know, if it continues to produce the amount of carbon that it does at the moment.
Kerry, from the moment we've started, everything you have said has been music to my ears. Now I want to be a bit audacious and challenge you and Anush both, because I think if we take the full integrated emissions of China, even on coal-generated power plants, and tie that to the manufacturing that was done for multinationals and Western corporations in China, and then on the other side of the ledger, add the scope 1, 2, and 3 of military adventurism of the West and United States, from Afghanistan, Cambodia, Vietnam, you know, Iraq, and measure that carbon emissions that I have written extensively about, China is not that bad. And as well, to correlate the investments made by China in relation to its defense budget and what the United States has put into renewables. But I want to shift for a second and bring you and Anush to the $34 trillion of US federal debt and ballooning by 44% in the past 3 years alone. And is there a threshold in your view that the Global South at one point would say, how can a government that is broke and every 2 years has to go in, you know, passing a bill to make the bills and, you know, government bills to be paid, can apply sanctions on the Global South? Do you think that China and Global South, Brazil, India as well, who are in the firing line, sooner or later, like Russia, will say, enough is enough, we need a new currency, we need a new currency basket, we need a new monetary architecture?
Well, I think for some time China has had that dream, I guess. I think the People's Bank of China head about 15 years ago, Zhou Xiaochuan, he was saying that there needed to be a new global currency that wasn't the dollar. He didn't say it should be the renminbi. I mean, I think that he was suggesting there should be something completely new. I think that in many ways, China's Belt and Road Initiative is an attempt to create a world where America isn't sort of omnipresent. I think it's an attempt to, you know, give China some sort of flexibility where it's not constantly monitored by the United States and, you know, feels that it sort of really has its space restricted. And I think that in many ways, China would be happy if it had the sort of set of alliances in the global south where it was able to do the things it wanted on its terms, probably quite transactional, probably fairly opportunistic and self-interest driven. And it didn't sort of, you know, kind of have to operate in a world and a system which it feels was created before it had a voice and didn't really have any kind of input into. I think that that's its real kind of aim, to have as much strategic space as possible, but not to have sort of global domination. Because I don't think it wants responsibility. I mean, I don't think China wants responsibility for, you know, things that are happening that don't directly relate to it. And so I don't think it kind of really wants to get too deeply involved in the Middle East, although it's likely to be sucked in more and more because of its interest there. I think it doesn't want to get too involved in, you know, developmental issues in Africa and Latin America unless it absolutely has to. I mean, it has looked at what the West has done over the last 100 and 150 years in great detail and has drawn conclusions. And I think it's not stupid in the way that it's sort of looked at the Western record. And I think that's made it very, very risk averse. But it certainly wants strategic space, and it feels very frustrated that it hasn't got that at the moment.
Kerry, so let's imagine that China is trying to create, as you said, this strategic space, and it needs to do so, I think, within its own kind of geopolitical neighborhood. But when you look at things, putting Taiwan aside for a moment, it has a troubled ally on the Korean Peninsula. It has a crumbling ally in the shape of the military junta in Myanmar. It has a decrepit ally in Putin's Russia. It has a troublesome competitor in India, right? And it also continues to kind of poke here and there at Japan, which in our lifetime might go nuclear because of the fears that it has of both North Korea and China for that matter. And so to me, it doesn't look like it's managing its own little neighborhood, let alone look at the bigger strategic space with a view to seek promotion, protection of its interests, let alone be able to stabilize these things. What is your take?
Well, I think someone once said that, you know, if you took America and put it in China's neighborhood with the neighbors that China has, and you put China in America's neighborhood, you know, you can suddenly work out why their diplomacy is so different. I mean, America's just got Canada and Mexico, right? And okay, these are not exactly going to cause it a big headache, although Mexico does cause it headaches. But China's neighbors, well, it's got 14 land neighbors, as you rightly say. I mean, North Korea, Russia, Mongolia, Afghanistan, Pakistan, India, Myanmar. You know, this is not an easy neighborhood. And I mean, 4 of them are nuclear powers. So, you know, this is probably why China has such an extremely risk-averse view of the world, because it's surrounded by, you know, massive crises in a way, just waiting to happen. I mean, I think it's, you know, kind of commitments to some of these alliances are, you know, kind of very questionable. People talk about China and Russia like they're big friends, but I don't think that's an equal friendship at all. I mean, I think that China's quite irritated sometimes by the way that Putin's behaved over Ukraine. However, of course, it's got a massive border with Russia, huge relationship, and big energy needs. So it maintains a workable relationship. With North Korea, this is not an easy relationship, although they have a security alliance that was recently renewed. the only one that China actually has a formal treaty with another country. North Korea and China have very, very deep distrust between them and have never had an easy relationship. And Kim Jong-un recently, with his more aggressive attitude to South Korea, this is not exactly helpful for China at the moment with the other issues it's dealing with. And finally, India. China's relations with India are not easy at all. These are two very nationalistic powers, very proud powers, very culturally strong powers. India now a bigger population than China, still a much smaller economy, but growing strongly. This is not going to be an easy relationship in the future. I imagine that's going to be the more difficult one in the decades ahead. India and China do not get on deep down. They have deep sort of reservations about each other. And I think that they're going to have a tough time trying to sort of cooperate with each other in the future, in view of the mutual misunderstanding and the kind of the lack of desire really to engage with each other. I mean, India has not engaged with the Belt and Road Initiative at all. And I think although Modi and Xi Jinping on a personal level have a good relationship, I think my observation in 30 years of going to China and visiting is that I'm often surprised at how little interest, knowledge, and engagement with India there is in China.
Kerry, sitting in United Kingdom, England, all three of us, where does that put UK being out of the tent of EU post-Brexit, in Pewter era, post-Golden era with China, and no trade deal with United States? How do you think UK is playing its cards? And in the broader context, even if United Kingdom feels that, you know, Falkland Islands is worth of sending the naval ships, why China shouldn't be as protective about the historical tie with Taiwan? Where are we playing our violin in this concert?
Yeah, I mean, I think that the UK's policy on China at the moment is fairly schizophrenic. I mean, one day we're saying that China is a big economic opportunity, and the next day we're saying that it's our greatest economic threat. And that's all been said in the last year. I mean, when James Cleverly was foreign minister, he made this sort of speech about China being a necessary partner, one we can't ignore. And yet Rishi Sunak, a few months before, when he became prime minister, declared the end of the golden era and said, you know, basically that Britain and China were not happy allies and couldn't continue to pretend to be so. I think Britain is obviously outside the European Union, has a different kind of status with China. I mean, it's not it's more exposed, it's much more open to Chinese criticism. When we were in the EU, we used to be able to kind of go collectively on things that were sensitive and difficult, like human rights, and deal with them on block, as it were. Now we can't do that. I think China still sees Britain as an important finance partner, an important potential investment place, and an important place, you know, for universities. Although all of those are slipping a little bit as we go forward. I think that Britain at the moment, under the current administration, is, you know, pretty complacent about its relations with China. We have a sense that we're more important than we are. And I think that our politicians, well, I think they can have a bit of a shock. I don't think Xi Jinping thinks about them a great deal. And he doesn't probably think about Britain as a place that he wants to sort of dominate and come to and, you know, kind of send spies to kind of conquer. I think he just thinks of us as a middle-ranking power that are quite useful, but expendable, extremely expendable. Finally, on Hong Kong, I mean, it's a great pity what has happened. I mean, you know, the kind of way in which security in Hong Kong has been dealt with in the last decade is obviously not great. However, at the end of the day, in 1997, when retrocession happened, you know, all of the sovereign powers for Hong Kong reverted to Beijing, and there was nothing that Britain could really do. we have seen at least 20 years of a kind of reasonable deal. I mean, that was 20 years, probably more than some people expected. I think that Hong Kong obviously has been a very bad advert for Taiwan. Taiwan will not accept the one country, two systems being offered. And Taiwan is a much more significant issue and a much more difficult issue. I don't see any solution to it at the moment, except to stick by the status quo and strategic ambiguity.
I think that, you know, we're in an era of, you say messy ambiguity. I say from diplomacy, we're in diplomacy. And I bring our sessions with one question, two questions to our guest always. And that is, what would be your single most important piece of advice to the xenophobes and to the xenophiles?
Well, I mean, to the xenophobes, I would encourage them to relax a bit and not be as scared as they seem to be, because that's very flattering for China. And ask really whether British people are able to believe in Xi Jinping thought for the new era. I think this is not going to happen. I don't think we need to worry about that. For the cinephiles, well, it's never good to be naive. And I think I've had to talk to audiences sometimes who, you know, kind of were very, very sort of embracing and thought nothing but good could come from China. And, you know, a lot of good does come from China, but we're all very, very kind of realistic. We live in a harsh world. We need to understand who we are and what we want from China. And I think then we will be okay. But we do need to understand who we are and what we want.
Kerry, that is a fantastic note to finish on. I've thoroughly enjoyed our interactions with you, as I'm sure has Ali. Your discussion of the West, dare I say, in transition rather than decline, is a very important takeaway for us. And someone said it's also partly with the caliber of political leaders that we have, that we're going through this crisis. And as you were speaking, I was reflecting on our current political leaders, comparing them to some in the past and seeing the reality of this in action in terms of what you were saying. That's an important thing for our audience to take away. But also your point about China's geopolitics and the importance of the struggle for whatever it is, let's not call it for power, the struggle in Asia that's going on between China and India. Something that we have to take note of, but it's particularly worrying that New Delhi and Beijing don't seem to be that fussed about it. And it's like a very slow train crash that you kind of forewarn us about, and yet not just those two countries, but the rest of us don't seem to be paying much attention to. And I think that is a really important point to underline for us, that your wisdom shows. But it's been a pleasure to see you in person, having read you extensively for so long. And I would highly recommend your book to our audience, which is not just a great read, but also very educational. So from Ali and I, very, very much enjoyed our conversation with you. Thank you, Kerry.
Thank you very much. Great to see you both, and hopefully I can meet you in person at some point. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Kerry.
Absolutely.
Cheers,